Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to come give the Dunster Lecture. I have to say, when I received the invitation, of course, I have to say yes. I mean, this is very prestigious, so I'm not going to turn it down. But I have to admit that it was quite a daunting idea to give the Dunster Lecture. Anyway, let's see how it goes, shall we? So today I'm going to be talking about the past and future history of RP and mixing in ICRP for obvious reasons. I am the CEO and scientific secretary of ICRP, and ICRP has been at the center of radiological protection almost since the beginning. And I use this strange turn of phrase, past and future history, just to mark the idea that what we're doing today and in the next few years will also be history in the future. This is just a moment in time in radiological protection. So I think it's important to start by recognizing John Dunster. This is his award, after all. He dedicated his career to radiological protection. He was involved in several high-profile accidents, in the response to the Windscale accident and in response to the Chernobyl accident as well. And I understand, although I've never had the pleasure of meeting John, unfortunately, I understand he was quite passionate about radiological protection and ICRP in particular. He joined in 1959 and he stayed quite a long time, eventually joining the main commission in 1977. And he received a rare honor of being elected or selected as an emeritus member when he left active service with ICRP in 1997. This does not happen very often. He, Bo Lindell, and Dan Benenson, perhaps the other two figures, at least outside the UK, have a higher profile, but the three of them were a really central team in developing the recommendations leading to publication 60. And I understand that he was a pleasure to work with because he had a quick wit and also quite a sharp wit, I understand. So not always easy to chat with, I suppose, but always entertaining, I can imagine. The complete honesty part is the one that gets me. I think that's fantastic, but can also, and did in fact, lead to some difficulties. And I think it's also important to recognize the past Dunster lecturers. When I look at this list, and I did review it after receiving the invitation, it even made me think more how daunting this is. I've worked with and know just about everyone on the list. These are the giants in RP on whose shoulders we stand, of course, among many others in the distant past. Some I know very well. Jack Valentine at the bottom of the list, the first Dunster lecturer, is my predecessor. He was scientific secretary of ICRP before me, and I consider him my mentor in this undertaking that I have right now. And of course, I worked with Claire Cousins in ICRP when she was chair. I was scientific secretary. We worked for 12 years to improve ICRP, the way ICRP works, while still ICRP is working, which was quite a task to drag the old organization into the 20th and maybe 21st century. So it's a real pleasure to join this fantastic list of key figures in RP. So let's begin at the beginning. I thought Lewis Carroll was nice to quote because, well, he was from around here. I think I will start at the beginning, at least one of the beginnings of radiological protection. I don't know if I can go on to the end because there isn't one, but the end will be in about 45 minutes or maybe an hour, so that's when it will stop. One way of looking at the beginning of radiological protection is the discovery of X-rays. You could argue that there was some RP of a sort even before radiation was known. I mean, there were known effects in mines that had a lot of radium. They didn't know what radium was at the time, and therefore uranium, I should say, and therefore radon daughter products. But nonetheless, real RP, I think, began just after the discovery of X-rays in 1895, near the end of 1895. And very rapidly, instantaneously in today's world, it would have happened, but they didn't have Twitter back then. Back then, at the speed of mail, the idea of using radiation in medicine spread like wildfire around the world. It was used everywhere. Here you can see just a couple of years later, this Major Battersby, who's on the left, watching the stopwatch for how long this patient's getting exposed. in wartime on the Nile, in the war in Sudan, just 1898, so only a couple of years after discovery of X-rays. It's already being used in this way. You can imagine that he probably got a lot of radiation dose. The Crookes tube is this far from him, and I imagine he would have been there all day taking X-rays of patients. But the fellow on the right might have been in more danger because that electrical equipment looks quite... I'd rather be on the left than the right, I think. Although on the right, at least you know when you've got it. Also very rapidly, it was not just used for X-rays, not just used for, but also for fluoroscopy and dental X-rays. These are not the earliest instances of the use of these. This is already in the 1900s, early 1900s, but these were nice pictures to show. And something I find really fascinating, in particular about the left picture, when you think about it, you can see the Crookes tube in the bottom left, and the physician is basically looking at a fluorescing screen. When you think about it, he's getting a face full of X-rays all the time he looks down that tube. The patient's getting a little bit to the arm. He's getting a lot to the eyes and head. I think I'd rather be the patient, because the patient might get 1 or 2 or 3 X-rays, but that physician's also probably had it all day, every day for weeks. So, not only diagnosis, but also treatment quite rapidly after the discovery of X-rays. You can see 2 different treatment methods. I suppose the physician is in less danger in this case because they don't tend to hang around for hours and hours. But nonetheless, this just gives you an idea of how quickly these different modalities of both treatment and diagnosis were used worldwide after the discovery of X-rays. And of course, there were some uses that we would call more frivolous today. I mean, most of you know most of these things, but it's a nice way to start. When I get my shoes fit, I just put them on and see if they feel right. Back in the day, it was exciting to have a look through a fluoroscope at your toes to see how crunched they were in your shoe, because clearly you couldn't feel that. Come on, strange. But it must have been a great novelty before they really understood what the hazards were of ionizing radiation and X-rays. Being able to see that your feet are nice and straight rather than crushed over to one side. And as you can see, both the salesman and the person buying the shoes could have a look at the same time. So quite exciting, but maybe not a good use today. Going back though to almost the beginning, 1896, almost immediately, it became obvious that there was also a darker side to the use of X-rays. You can see part of a short paper by Drury, who talks about a patient he had who sat in front of the X-ray machine for 1 hour on a day. When he walked home, he didn't feel very well, shockingly. And sadly, it turns out the X-ray was not good enough, so he came back, I think it was 5 days later, and had another X-ray for 1.5 hours. So this poor fellow had 2.5 hours this far from the Crookes tube. And as you can imagine, on his second return home, he felt quite sick. He had to stop for a brandy, so it must have been quite tough. And a few weeks later, he'd developed more severe skin reactions. So this was known quite early on. The pictures on the right are more from operators. This would be, because sometimes they would use their hand in the beam to see how long it took to get read, to see how good the beam was. That's not the only problem, but that was certainly one of the problems. So early on, it was known that there were issues. The first published RP advice, though, was in 1896, so almost exactly 1 year after discovery of X-rays, so not very long at all, especially in a world without social media. When Wolfram Fuchs published this in the Western Electrician, again, a very short article. This is probably 80% of it shown on the left. And he makes a few fairly familiar observations, a few suggestions. Shorten the exposure to a minimum. Place the tube not too close to the body. And rubbing Vaseline was more about something else. But you can see the use of glass plates to protect otherwise exposed body parts. So it's time, distance, and shielding. Nothing particularly new to us today, but it was new at the time. I can imagine that these practices were already being used in some places around the world in the year prior, but this is the first publication, and it's so new that I can imagine many people hadn't even thought of it. But it's interesting to see that his focus here is on protection of the patient, and not so much on protection of the practitioner. It's not mentioned at all in his article. It's fair to say that this wasn't often a problem. I think he had something like 1,200 patients that he treated at the time, and only 4 showed these reactions. So it wasn't happening every day that patients were being severely overexposed to the point of deterministic effects, but it was often enough that he thought it desirable to prevent the inconvenience and burn and pain of the sunburns. So the first time the radiological protection became international was at the first International Congress of Radiology, held in London in 1925, so not so far from here. You'll see many UK connections in this presentation, and that happened almost by accident because there's a lot of UK influence in the early days of radiological protection. This photograph is hanging in my office, my office area, and it's been there for more than 10 years, but it's not until I used it in this presentation that I noticed in the front corner is quite a young Rolf Siebert, looking not too thrilled about having his picture taken. And the most pressing issue at the time, of course, protection was an issue, that was the main point, but they really wanted to have some quantification of radiation exposure, and there was none really at the time. So formed at this Congress was the International X-ray Unit Committee, which is now known as ICRU. The second Congress happened 3 years later in Stockholm, and interestingly enough, can you spot him? He's there again. There he is, also looking not so happy to be there. Nonetheless, it must have been quite a nice dinner. We had the main commission and many guests hosted by the Swedish Regulatory Authority, SSM, had dinner in this same room just a few years ago on our 90th anniversary. And the room looks the same, but now it's in color. So 2 big things for RP people came out at this second Congress. The first is that the Röntgen unit was established. They used a small R back then, but nonetheless, this is the first time we have some kind of quantitative assessment of radiation exposure. The second big point, the big excitement, at least especially for us, is that the predecessor to ICRP was formed in 1928. It was called the IXRPC, International X-ray and Radiation Protection Committee, and you can see the first 7 gentlemen at the time who were in the committee. Interestingly enough, I have original documents from these meetings, and there's a big book of photographs. Can you imagine the expense it must have been in 1928 to take photographs of nearly 1,000 people and put them in a book? So there are photographs of 6 of the 7 original members. You can see quite a young Rolf Siebert in the top left corner, an even younger Lorison Taylor from the US in the bottom right-hand corner. I mean, he's just about a teenager. Unfortunately, the Italian guy was not on the list of people whose photograph made it into the catalog. I want to point something out though, and I don't mean any respect to Rolf Siebert. He played a huge role in RP, especially since he came back later to be chair of ICRP again. But in the early days, the chairs of these meetings were an honorary position. At the next meeting, it was someone else because someone local from the organizing, someone local was selected to be on as the chair of the meeting. It was really the secretaries who ran it in between. And in particular, in this case, George Kay was the major player in arranging all of this, and even for the next several years up until World War II. So he's a much less known figure because there's no unit named after him or special name named after him. But you should be proud that George Kay and his colleague, at least for this meeting, Stanley, played a major role in the formation of what is now ICRP and the ICRP recommendations. These are the first recommendations. That's all of it. I'm not just cutting out pieces. It was 3 1/4 pages, which is approximately 100 times shorter than the ICRP publication 103. That tells you something about what's happened in the intervening years. But it set out some basic ideas. In 1928, who's protected? The focus is really on the operator and radium workers. There's no mention of patients, interestingly enough, even though we saw already Fuchs and others must have been protecting patients for decades or for quite some time. The effects are primarily injuries to the superficial tissues and whatever derangements of internal organs and changes in the blood mean. Unclear. And the advice was very practical. and very qualitative. So don't stand in front of X-ray if you don't have to, not surprising, and stay away from the X-ray tube as much as you reasonably can. So pretty basic advice. And again, just for the operator of the X-ray equipment and radium workers. In the 1930s, this continued to focus just on occupational exposure. The effects hadn't really changed much, although there was more knowledge about what the thresholds were thought to be at the time for some of the effects. And in 1934, the first idea of a daily tolerance dose was introduced. First iteration of a dose limit. It's a bit higher than it is today, but nonetheless, it's there. And then World War II happened, so there wasn't a lot of international collaboration on the RP front, I would say, during World War II. A lot of bad things happened, including the dropping of bombs, atomic bombs, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But of course, that also plays a huge role in understanding radiation effects today, because a large part of our knowledge today is based on the atomic bomb survivors. Not exclusively, but that's for a long time, that was the main standard. After World War II, so after World War II, it took a few years, but the group got back together again, and now it was renamed ICRP, which has stayed that since then. And who's protected expanded immediately. So it included all radiation workers now in 1950, and a few years later, this was expanded to patients in what they called large populations. Not exactly protection of the public, because that implies individuals as we know it today, but more about protection of humankind. So a more a broader approach. It's not quite what we see today. The effects focus was still on thresholds in the early 50s at least, but there was growing evidence of effects at lower doses, not least to mention cancer and leukemia from atomic bomb survivor data. We have new dose limits, but not quite dose limits yet, but weekly permissible doses. And an important statement in 1954, in view of the incomplete evidence, it's probably best that we make all efforts to reduce exposure to all types of ionizing radiation to the lowest possible level. That's quite strict. I mean, we're not quite that strict today. The lowest possible level is 0. But we're a little more nuanced today. Also in the 1950s, I mean, there was a lot of excitement about many things, nuclear and atomic, was the Castle Bravo nuclear test on Bikini Atoll, which didn't go quite as planned. The explosion was much larger than expected, and the wind was going in an unfavorable direction. And as a result, the ship on the bottom right you see is the Lucky Dragon number 5. It received a lot of fallout. One crew member was diagnosed with acute radiation sickness, and I'll show you in a moment that he died not long after, and all of them got probably quite high doses. And it also, I mean, this is tragic, of course, but maybe more importantly, this became international news, not just across Japan, but around the world. I've seen articles in newspapers from everywhere that talk about this incident. So it became something in the international zeitgeist. This awareness that these atomic bomb tests and radiation in general can still be dangerous. Even if you can see your foot in the X-ray, doesn't mean we should be so cavalier about radiation. And in fact, the first Godzilla movie, Gojira, came out the same year as the Lucky Dragon incident, just later in that year. And the filmmaker said that the first scene in the movie is Godzilla destroying a Japanese boat, is a direct reference to the Bikini Atoll test affecting the Japanese fishing boat. You can go see the fishing boat. It's still there. I went and visited a few years ago. It's quite big, fascinating, and you can see a little bit of information here. It's not just about those few fishermen who were affected. There's a list of the deaths there, but only one very soon after. The others may or may not be related to the radiation, but nonetheless. But it also affected hundreds of tons of tuna being thrown away, literally dumped in holes and buried because they were radioactive enough not to be sold. So back to direct RP. Moving into the 1960s, we're dealing with workers, patients, and the public, so very close, very familiar formulation today. The effects are clearly now stochastic and deterministic. It's obvious by the 1960s that cancer is an important factor. And of course, for those of you who are maybe newer to the profession, when we talk about stochastic effects, we talk about effects whose probability increase with dose. Cancer is the main one. And we talk about deterministic effects as effects that have a threshold in principle below which you won't see any effect. And as you go above the threshold, the severity of the effect will increase. So two quite different approaches to effects. In terms of protection advice, it's the first time we talk about assuming a linear relationship between dose and effect. This is now very famous, the LNT, but many people don't read the parts about things like it might not be right, but it's unlikely to lead to underestimation of risks. ICRP has never claimed that the LNT model, whatever you want to call it, is right. It probably isn't. Not many things in biology are straight lines. But nonetheless, this is a tool for protection. And we also said at the time, ICRP said at the time, that any exposure may involve some degree of risk. It doesn't say it absolutely does, but it might. We just don't know. So to deal with this, the advice was to keep dose as low as is reasonably achievable, economic and social consequences being taken into account. Almost the same of what we talk about today. In 1977, I see as a real milestone year for ICRP and radiologic protection. It's the 1977 recommendations in publication 26 that really set the shape of the system of protection and how everyone does RP around the world today. You can see the objective here, protection of individuals, progeny, mankind as a whole, but still allowing necessary activities. Classification of effects in stochastic and non-stochastic. It has justification, optimization of protection, and individual dose limitation, the three fundamental principles. It talks about radiation detriment. It talks about reference levels. It talks about committed to dose. All of these are key ideas, concepts that were introduced before or in publication 26 quite some years ago. Interestingly, maybe interesting for me, I started my career almost exactly 10 years after this came out, publication 26 came out. And for the first few years, I was working in RP right from the beginning. I knew a lot about practical RP, but I didn't really know about ICRP, some mysterious organization you've never really heard of before. But then someone gave me a copy of publication 26, and I was fascinated. I read the whole thing in a weekend. I don't do that anymore. I'm not quite that enthusiastic. But for me, I found it fascinating to learn about these unknown people who put together these sophisticated and still, to some degree, quite practical advice for radiological protection. And they're doing it as a charity and not getting paid, which is even more interesting. So anyway, publication 26 really is the basis of modern radiological protection. Of course, there have been some changes over the years. And you can see here, for instance, there's been some changes in the wording of some of these ideas. You can see a statement, for instance, from the 1990s about if man is adequately protected, then other living things are also likely to be sufficiently protected, which is a nice assumption, but it's just an assumption that's maybe not true in all cases. And protection is still justification, optimization, individual dose limitation. So other than this idea of starting to think about the environment but not doing anything was the only fundamentally new idea, I would say, that came in the few years after that publication. Today, again, it hasn't radically changed. We have justification, optimization, and dose limitation. We have dose constraints that aid in optimization. And the philosophy is about the same, an appropriate level of protection without unduly limiting useful things, basically. There's maybe an increased focus on deontological ethics. I'll come back to the ethics in just a minute. But the main new point in publication 103 was the real introduction of protection of the environment, not because ICRP thought that there was major harm being done to environments all over the world, but because we felt, reflecting on society's feelings, that it's not enough to say, oh, it's fine. it's important that we demonstrate that we're taking a careful look to make sure environments are not being impacted around the world. So let's, one thing I didn't talk about much during the evolution of the recommendations or radiological protection yet is the ethical basis. And in part, that's because until recently, we basically didn't talk about it at all explicitly in any of our recommendations. It's not quite true. There's a few lines here and there, but it's more or less absent in terms of being very clear. But it's fair to say that pre-World War II, the idea was very much akin to virtue ethics. So act properly and things will be fine, which is an ancient theory from Socrates, from that era, and works quite well if we're all virtuous people. From the 1960s, though, it started to focus more on utilitarian consequentialism. So what is the outcome of your actions? Is the outcome good or bad, positive or negative? So the greatest good for the greatest numbers. So a shift, not abandoning the virtue ethics, but layering this on top, which philosophy experts would say, you can't do that, but we did, because we're trying to take into account some very complex situations. By the way, if you want to see Jeremy Bentham, who was in the picture just before, but I failed to tell you that, you can go visit him. He's not so far away in University College London. He sits in a booth in a hallway that's normally closed, but on certain days, or probably if you ask, you can see that's him. His skeleton's inside his clothes. The head didn't really do very well, so it's no longer displayed there. Instead, they've added a wax figure of his head. But nonetheless, I have yet to go see Jeremy, but I do plan to sometime soon. Oh, maybe on the weekend. Anyway, just a crazy side note. More modern, in more modern days, we've been focusing more, I'd say, on duty-based ethics, and that is doing what is doing the right thing, not necessarily based on a virtue like the older idea, but this is having a duty to not tell a lie, for instance, is considered a duty, and Kant is the main guy in that field. And all three of these schools have problems, have limitations, and as again, philosophers would say you can't just mix them, that doesn't make any sense, but we did and do, because we have duty-based ethics like please protect individuals, which doesn't really work well with consequentialist ethics that say the greatest good for the greatest number. I mean, who for who? I mean, who's the winner there? So one person dies and 1,000 live? Sure, that's good, but it's also bad. So mixing these together is important, I think, to have a more comprehensive view of the ethics of RP. And in fact, in publication 138 in 2018 was the first time we had a publication dedicated solely to the ethics of radiological protection. We talk only a little bit about these classical schools of thought, and we focus more on core ethical values. And these are core ethical values that you can find in some way or another within these schools of thought, but they're meant to be universal values that almost every reasonable person, hopefully every reasonable person, can agree to. The ideas of beneficence and non-maleficence, which is just promoting or doing good and avoiding harm. Hard to argue with that. The idea of prudence. There's a great poster about prudence, by the way, just in one of the halls there. I really enjoyed it. You should all go see it. Prudence, the way we think about it, is acting wisely, basically. So of course we should act wisely. Even without full knowledge, we should do our best to make well-informed, wise decisions. Justice. There's many kinds of justice, but in our case, it's mainly being fair to people. And dignity, treating people with the dignity they deserve because they're human beings. Pretty difficult to argue with these basic concepts. And it took us several years of discussions, not just within ICRP, not just within the RP community, but with philosophy and ethics experts as well, in almost 10 workshops all around the world to come up with this, for me, fundamentally important document, because it gives us a language to discuss the ethical foundations of the system. For years, we've had language to discuss the scientific basis of the system, but not until now have we had a common language to talk about the ethical basis. So let's take a quick review. Over the years, in terms of effects, what we understood as effects In the early days, it was these inconvenient sunburns. Soon it became more obvious. In 1928, we talked about injuries to the superficial tissues and so on. In the 1950s and especially 1960s, we are more aware of cancer and other things that have become an issue. Finally, in 1977, we come down to this division for radiological purposes into two groups of effects, stochastic and non-stochastic. In 1990, we changed that to deterministic, but the concept is basically the same. 2012, we changed some language, but the concept is basically the same. And today, we're looking at new kinds of effects that we hadn't considered before. You can see cognitive effects and circulatory disease effects that probably won't immediately change this division into two categories of effect, but just to show you that there's still more work going on and new things coming up all the time. Who and what is being protected? At the very beginning, we saw patients, probably because it was most obvious, even in the first patients, probably especially in the first patients, they might have got a lot of dose and you see the effects immediately. Not too long after, there were recommendations about, or there was protection for workers, especially X-ray operators, and you can see that codified in the 1928 recommendations. We introduced patients in large populations in 1954, and in 1960, we are more or less where we are today, workers, patients, and members of the public. It wasn't until 2007 recommendations where we introduced really, in a fundamental recommendation, the idea of protection of the environment. And most recently, you can see protection of veterinary patients. This is, I see this as a trend. I mean, you can start with something very narrow and keep expanding until what? I don't know. Wait till the end of my presentation. I have some ridiculous guesses. But you can see what's really changed over the years, in part because what was known about the effects, and in part because social pressures or social expectations changed. As I said about the environment, we didn't change it because we didn't introduce protection of the environment because we thought it was a big problem. We introduced it because it was socially required to be a little less flippant about protection of the environment, to be a little more careful. In terms of RP advice, at the very beginning, it was just avoid harm. Try not to get bad skin burns. I mean, that was it, with some ideas of time, distance, and shielding. By 1928, it became more quantitative, but still nothing really fundamentally changed. It was still just avoid harm so you don't get skin burns. 1934 was the first kind of dose limit. And in 1954 was a pretty fundamental change in thinking. It's not just the skin burns that might be an issue or other deterministic effects. Cancer might be a problem even at considerably lower doses. And today we have justification, optimization of protection, and individual dose limitation, with really optimization of protection being at the center. This is the center of radiological protection. That doesn't mean the other two fundamental principles aren't important. They are, for limiting cases especially, but optimization is king. Another way to look back at the history is looking at the general recommendations. So we've only had, I think it's 12, general recommendations since the beginning. And you saw the first one in 1928 that was 3.5 pages. And I've told you a bit about the evolutions that went on in the early years, mainly because it was brand new. So every few years there were some tweaks to the recommendations. By World War II, that was relatively solid, but then there was these new effects that they were seeing from some medical patients, but mainly from A-bomb survivors. So 1950, 54, 56, 59, 64, 66, very rapid changes due to the new knowledge about cancer and how to deal with that. I highlight publication 26, as I discussed before. I think it's the basis of what we do today. And I would say publication 60 and 103 carry on with that basis with, I hope, improvements, clarifications, expansions in areas we hadn't considered before. And of course, next are the next general recommendations. It's been much more than 20 years since, it will be more than 20 years since 103 came out, before the next general recommendations came out, which will be the largest gap in between general recommendations. And I see that as a maturing of radiological protection, a maturing after publication 26, where we don't need to make such rapid changes. We have other publications that talk about things that happen in between, but it's becoming much more stable. So we've initiated this review and revision of the system of protection, not because it's broken, but because we want to make sure it remains not broken, fit for purpose. It's been a quarter century since we began the last review in the late 1990s. So it's time. There are also other more concrete reasons, but in part, it's time. This will lay down the next general recommendations that will be the basis of everything all of us do in RP pretty much everywhere. It will supersede the 2007 recommendations, so it will be the new publication 103, maybe 203, who knows? I don't know which number it'll be. So this will be an RP for the next generation. But the next generation has another meaning as well. If I look in the audience, there's actually a fair number of people younger than me, which is both great and terrible. But it's you younger people who will be using these recommendations. I mean, ICRP doesn't use the recommendations anyway. That's not our job. We build them. Other people use them. I will probably never be in a position to use the new recommendations. I hope to be retired when they come out, just after they come out. But many people in this audience will be using the next general recommendations. So you should be involved in building them. You're here, you're interested, you're active already. And there are ways to be involved in helping build them. There are a few overarching considerations. Of course, it must be inclusive, accessible, and transparent. I say of course, but the first 10 sets of recommendations were nothing like that at all. At the beginning, it was 7, I was going to say old men, but that's these days, young men sitting in a room, and they wrote some stuff up and sent it out, and that was it. The 2007 recommendations were relatively consultative, with 2 official and really 3 rounds of consultations worldwide on the general recommendations. But this time around, we're taking this up 10 notches. We're trying our best to be extremely inclusive, extremely accessible, and as transparent as possible. And I think I'll come to that again in a few minutes. It's a shame to have to say this, but it's true. The system has to be based on solid science and ethical values. We don't just make stuff up, hardly. It's really based on the best science we can find out there, which is not always consensus science, so there's still controversy, and solid ethical values. And I'm very happy to say that we can talk about these ethical values much more clearly now. The updates have to contribute to improved protection. That doesn't mean we're going to lower the dose limits by a factor of 2 to improve protection. That's not improving protection, that's making a number lower. Better protection is not necessarily stricter protection, it's better protection. It has to be easier to communicate and easier to use. Yeah, our documents aren't always the easiest to read, I understand that. And much of it's not directly applicable, but it's sort of indirectly applicable to your daily work. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that what we recommend is clear or understandable, because the less it's understood, the less it's implemented and the less, let's say, increase in protection there is. So one of our key ideas this time around is to try and make it easier to communicate and easier to use. However, that doesn't mean making it dumber and simpler. We're not going back to 3.5 pages. That won't happen. It's impossible, because the underlying basis is much more complex than it was in 1928. And it has to be robust. It has to be carefully thought through, and it is complex. It is difficult to get through. You can't be an expert in the ethics and all aspects of the science and everything in the system of protection, but people in ICRP do have to be experts in those areas and do have to look carefully and make sure the underlying basis is robust. And hopefully we can translate that robust basis into something that's more easily digestible, not necessarily simpler, but as I said, again, easier to understand, easier to communicate, easier to use. Let's see how well we do. Our track record so far has been medium. I think it's getting better, but this will be a real challenge. If you want, you can have a look at this. I was glad to hear that the slides are available in the app, which I've not yet downloaded, but I'll do it right after my talk, to see some highlights on some of the things we've done so far, but I'm not going to dwell on that. So I think I have about 20 minutes left, is that right? Okay, good. You can see The first idea was a paper that we put out in 2001 in JRP, UK again, called Keeping the ICRP Recommendations Fit for Purpose. And this really launched the idea of a new set of general recommendations. In fact, the idea was first discussed in, and I'm going to get the year wrong, 2017, but it took some time for the main commission to discuss it, decide which way we're going to go, and develop this paper. And this paper talks about some views of ICRP on what might need some looking at, potential changes, not necessarily changes, but at least assessment. But more importantly, it was really an invitation to everyone, anywhere, to contribute their ideas. Because ICRP, we're a pretty big organization of about 400 people from about 50 countries, but that's a small part of the RP community. And we want to get as many good ideas as possible because we want this to be the best recommendations ever, don't we all? So the more input we have, the better. The second was another open access paper on areas of research to support the system of RP, which is a companion to the first one, really focusing on research efforts that would help, well, support the system of RP. And the next two open access papers summarize what we heard back from the RP community through various workshops and so on these two topics. So this really helped us go get to where we are today. These 4 papers summarizing the work on our thoughts and what we hear back from the community. And we use that to work on the next general recommendations. This is a very schematic view of the overall process. So the first step was to identify topics, or what we call building blocks, as we build the next general recommendations. And I think we've pretty much done that. We have a long list of topics. I'll show them to you in just a minute. That doesn't mean we're going to ignore something if it pops up, if we miss something. If one of you has a brilliant idea that we missed some piece, we'll look at that, of course. But our focus really now is on developing these ideas, using ICRP task groups primarily, but not exclusively. And at the end, when we're getting closer to completion, we'll prepare the next general recommendations using these building blocks. It sounds so simple. It's not. But this is not a stepwise process. It's going on, most of this a bit in parallel. And you can see that arrow there showing about a decade to reach the peak when we reach the next recommendations. That's to give you an idea that this is not a quick project that we do in a couple of years. This is a decade or maybe just a little bit more. I can tell you that we're aiming for very early 2030s to be complete. That is not a promise, that is a guess. But I hope we'll be able to issue the recommendations around that time. We currently have 30 task groups, which you can imagine is, well, maybe you can't imagine, it's a lot. Typically, we have about half that number of task groups going on in ICRP. Each of these task groups, most of these task groups produce one document that becomes a publication in Annals of the ICRP. Some of them produce 3 or 4, or maybe even 5 in one case. So there's a lot of work going on right now. As I said, this is about double what we typically handle. Some of these task groups are work that we had not yet completed before we started the review and revision. For instance, task group 98 on contaminated sites. There will be some implications, I guess, in the new recommendations due to this, but it's really work that's not yet finished from before. Most of the task groups listed here are addressing pretty key issues. I mean, task group 114 on reasonableness and tolerability. This is a central ethical practical idea in the system of radiological protection. Classification of radiation-induced effects. As I told you before, we now have stochastic and deterministic effects. Is this the right thing to do? That's a pretty basic question. Should we divide effects just into these two categories? How should we do it? Maybe we shouldn't change at all. And in many cases here, the result, it's not likely to be nothing at all to change, but I think in many cases it'll be nothing's really changing much in a particular area, but let's try and be more clear about what we're talking about. Let's try and make this more easy to communicate. You can see such a variety of things, low dose and low dose rate exposure. So looking at radiation effects, you can see mesh type computational phantoms, which we're issuing now, in fact. That is the next generation of phantoms for, at least for now, human dosimetry. You can see Individual response to radiation, which is looking at that particular task group. 111 is looking at a review of the science and what we know about the differences between individual people exposed to the same level or type of radiation. You can see offspring and next generations that talks about both human and non-human effects in later generations. A very wide variety of topics, so quite a challenge. But it also means that if you're interested in something very specific, it might just be on this list. So pay some attention. But that's not it. We have identified about 19 other topics. And I say about because we haven't initiated a task group or whatever on most of these. But we'll be addressing them in some way for sure. And here you can see still some pretty fundamental questions. I mean, the primary aim and the objectives for human environmental protection, that is the most fundamental piece of the system of protection. I don't think it'll take us a long time to look at it, but we will look at it. The principle of optimization of protection, as I said before, this is the centerpiece of ICRP recommendations and of RP around the world. We will review this. Again, it doesn't mean there will be big changes, but we're taking a serious look to make sure the next recommendations really cover everything we can reasonably cover. I can't possibly list them all or I'll run out of time. But you can also see there are a few topics, and most of these will be addressed probably by a task group or similar. Maybe not all of them, but most of them, except the ones at the bottom. We identified 4 cross-cutting topics that we think are very important, but maybe it's not most appropriate to write a standalone publication about, for instance, sources and impacts of uncertainties. Instead, we're looking at the work of every task group, and in that example, asking the question, what is the importance of the sources and impacts of uncertainties on the work of a particular task group? It's one task group, it might be something very scientific, I should say it's always scientific, also very numerical. In other, it might be less so, more judgmental. So there are particular questions to be answered in sources and impacts of uncertainty, sustainable development. I'm sure you've all heard of that, and there's another session on that tomorrow, I think. Education and training and communication. So we see these things as being broader than just one task group or one publication, but being reflected in many. And even before that, before we initiated this review and revision of the system, we were still working since publication 103, and we're up to publication 153, almost 154 any day now. So that's 50 more publications. Not all of them will have a significant impact on the review and revision because many of them are about particular uses in radiation, a particular medical procedure, or something else, just a particular circumstance, not necessarily a concept or so on. But nonetheless, there's a long list of publications that will probably have some impact on the new recommendations that are already out. You can see right from publication 104 on scope of control, which I think no one reads because it's right after 103, and when you're done reading 103, you're tired. But it's actually quite an interesting and useful publication. And you can see many in here. I mentioned the veterinary practice, which is I wouldn't say it's a revolutionary change in the system because, as I said, progression over time about what are the objects of protection. But it's certainly new and not tackled at all, almost at all before in the past, internationally at least. Yeah. If you've been asleep for the last half hour or so, you can just go to the ICRP website and get a quick summary of what I just said on the review and revision of the system. And this might be useful as, next year, hopefully we'll have updated it with more information on where we are and so on. But at least there's a place to go on the ICRP website, click on what we do, then I think click on the system of RP, and you'll see a page that gives you some highlights of what's going on. Okay, now for the interesting and likely controversial section. What's next? What will happen in the future? These speculations are only mine. Don't blame anybody else for my crazy ideas. Some of them might not be crazy, some of them might be. This is just my fault, so. I look back at some of the, where's Pete? I saw him earlier today. I looked back at some of the previous Dunster lectures and found this very foolish one by Pete Burgess. I can say this because he admitted it himself. Predicting the future is ridiculous. You can't do it properly. But he was very smart. He said, what's RP going to be like in 50 years? And what he said, I don't remember verbatim, is it's good to predict 50 years away because he'll be dead by then, so he doesn't care if he was wrong. I don't think there's a few at the end that are maybe in the 50-year time scale, but mainly I'm going to be using a shorter time scale, which is easier but also more dangerous, because if I'm wrong, I probably will still be alive. But don't blame me. These are just ideas. They're just ideas. But thank you very much, Pete, for this. This was quite an entertaining lecture. If you don't know, all of these lectures are recorded. I didn't watch all of them or every Pete, but it was hard not to continue watching Pete because he's very entertaining. This is an AI-generated image because, what a surprise, I think AI is going to play some important role in RP in the future. What? I don't know. And in fact, we've just started an ICRP working party, not a task group, so a group of people that's thinking about AI and looking about AI and see how it might impact things. And I thought that this is definitely not a Lewis Carroll interpretation, because Dolly, the tool I used, said, I can't do something in the style of Lewis Carroll because it's copyrighted. So I said, okay, draw me a white rabbit walking towards a black hole with a young girl behind her. So definitely nothing to do with Lewis Carroll, definitely not, especially since this is being recorded. Don't come after me. But it's quite clever what AI can do in terms of making interesting pictures these days. Speaking of AI, I thought first, well, let's just ask AI what will happen in the next 50 years. Kind of a ridiculous idea, but I have a subscription to ChatGPT-4, and I asked it the question, what will change in the world of RP in the next 50 years? Pete's question. And it gave, well, these are probably right, but they're a bit boring. Advanced detection and monitoring technologies. Yeah, that will change in the next 50 years unless everything goes to hell. Precision medicine and radiology. Well, it's happening now. I mean, this is not revolutionary. AI and automation. I thought it was quite kind to list that third. I thought that would come first or maybe last, to be very subtle, and I think there's something there, but I really don't know what. Enhanced decommissioning techniques. Again, not surprising. I mean, look at what's being done in Fukushima Daiichi and other places around the world with robotics and so on for decommissioning. Regulatory and standard changes. Anyone who's been alive for more than 10 years knows that it happens constantly. So of course that will change in the future. Education and training. So, okay, ChatGPT-4 is probably right, but not very informative, I would say. I don't think it's very creative. Another obvious answer is, well, we'll do some more research. But again, that's always what we do. We do more research, and for good reasons. First, people are curious. That's very good. And second, because we really would benefit in RP from knowing more about dose response and other things. Now, this one I didn't make up all on my own. We have a paper on areas of research to support the system. It was one of the 4 papers I mentioned earlier, and it looked at short-term, medium-term, and long-term research efforts that might be useful for radiological protection. So mechanisms, especially for low dose and low dose rates. I mean, the more we know about mechanisms, the more we can understand cancer and other effects, not just cancer, and the better we can be at protection. Dose response at various dose rates. That would also be very nice to know. I have a feeling that dose rates are more important than most people think, and it's not just the dose you get in terms of sieverts or whatever dose you're using, depending on what country you come from. Are there any Americans here? You said they were Americans, so if you don't know what sieverts are, you can look it up on the ICRP website. Biomarkers and radiation signatures. I mean, this is kind of the holy grail. If we could identify which cancers were caused by radiation, that would be great for research. But probably cancers are caused by lots of things all at once, so I'm not very optimistic. Maybe, I hope so. Effects of combined stressors. We like to call these cocktail effects because that's more fun. And that's actually one of the few topics we have on our list that we decided not to tackle before the next generation, the next recommendations, because it's quite hard. But it is on our list to tackle as we near the end of the process of developing the new general recommendations. So it's something we will likely be looking at quite seriously, either starting just before or just after the next general recommendations. Target regions for organs and tissues for dosimetry. Many of you probably think you average over the whole kidney or liver or skin or whatever, and that's kind of what we say, but it's not really what we do. We look for the subparts of organs and tissues that really matter for radiation exposure. And in some cases we know them, in some cases we don't. And there's also a corollary here about trying to segment those parts of the organs and tissues for doing dosimetry work. So quite interesting. Biokinetics of radioactive substances, we've been working on that for decades and we'll continue to work on that, of course. And I feel bad just putting one line for social sciences and humanities, but my slide's only so big, so I stopped it there. Just to point out that RP is not a science. RP is, radiological protection is a guide to doing good RP. It's a guide, it's a policy guidance is what it is, what the ICRE recommendations are. Of course, heavily based on science, but also based on I should say physical sciences, also based on social sciences and humanities, including ethics and many other aspects. So I think social sciences and humanities has been growing in RP. I mean, the publication on ethics, publication 138 is an obvious example of that, and it will continue to grow, and et cetera, because there's lots more. So in the next general recommendations, again, this is a guess. It's my thoughts. I mean, I'm a bit on the inside. I know what's going on, but still, I might be wrong on some or all of these. But I think there'll be some very visibly obvious changes in the next general recommendations when you open up publication 203 or whatever. Maybe we'll have some key ideas up front. In our most recent recommendations, we've had key ideas at the very front of each publication, which helps us pull out that useful idea that's on page 74 near the bottom, but no one ever gets to, and puts them right at the front so we can talk about optimization, for instance, right at the beginning, at the front, in a sentence or two, so people are aware of what it might mean. And maybe that's a bad example. But I hope it'll be a little bit, there'll be some tools to help make it more understandable. I'm certain there'll be, I shouldn't say certain, I think it's likely there'll be explicit mention of the ethical basis, as I said before, alongside the scientific basis, so that when we give a recommendation, it's clear why, not just scientifically, but also ethically. I'm relatively sure there'll be something about broadening optimization. It's something we've talked about for a long time, and in fact, optimization is fairly broad already, taking into account societal and economic effects. I think we'll press that idea much more strongly in the next recommendations. I doubt we'll go into the details because we're not experts in chemical effects or heat stroke or whatever, any of these other factors, but we'll really start to press the idea that this is important, not to look just at dose, for instance, and monetary cost. Those are easy. In some cases it's enough, in many cases it's not. In environment and ecosystems, clearly this will be almost certainly in the next general recommendations. I mean, we advertise it in publication 103. How can we not have a large section of it in the next general recommendations on protection of the environment? And I'm hopeful maybe even on looking at ecosystems. I don't know how that's going to go yet, but you can ask Nicole, maybe she has a better idea. Individualization and stratification, which scares some people, but really shouldn't, I don't think. In RP, I think will be an important topic in the next general recommendation. We may or may not be in a position to say very much about how it should be used, but what wouldn't surprise me is some idea of individualization in medical care of individual patients. It would surprise me to see any level of individualization for public doses or worker doses, unless it's an accident situation or something like that, because it doesn't seem to be practical. But we have a task group looking at that right now. Sustainable development, I mentioned before, and I'm sure we'll have a prettier cover because nowadays we have prettier covers. So I went back to the AI and I said, what will the cover for the next general recommendations look like? Because I thought you'd be, well, maybe. It's now confirmed that the journal is called the analysis of the IICRP. I like that, that's great. And the Generale Recon Main, I can't pronounce that, Asians. Clearly we'll get our spelling better than that. I won't leave that up to Dolly entirely. But I can confirm that the next general recommendations will be released on some day, in some month, in the year starting with 2. I can pretty much guarantee that. However, I think this might be my last or second last slide. I think there'll be some smaller, maybe important, but maybe heading in a direction, change in the recommendations. I'm sure, I really hope there'll be many updates to improve clarity, to make it easier to communicate and easier to use. I really hope so, and we're working very hard on that. I think there'll be some reflection on human spaceflight, because we're looking at making recommendations that get released in 2030-ish, so they'll be implemented in late 2030s or 2040, and hopefully the last 20 years, so 2050s and 2060s. That's a long time from now. And unless something goes terribly wrong, I think there'll be a lot more human spaceflight, and we're really gonna have to pay a lot more attention, because the dose rates up there are not what we see on Earth. So I think there'll be at least some hint about where we're going there. No doubt there'll be mention of artificial intelligence. What? I have no clue. And what's most important is I think there won't be fundamental changes in the primary aim and projection objectives. I think there'll be a small tweak there. I don't think there'll be any fundamental change in justification, optimization, exposure situations, but this was a new invention of 103. Surely we'll have to make some clarifications, that's obvious. And the most risky one to talk about, I don't think there'll be a change in dose limits, but I don't know, probably not. This is non-binding. Most importantly, what I've said, these are my ideas, and this is such a hokey looking slide, it really drives me crazy. But when I asked Dali to make a picture of a lot of various people, it did that. And this is, honestly, it's not about what I think, it's more about what all of you think and all the other RP professionals around the world, because we do have a very open process. Submit something to our many, or join many of our workshops that we have online all the time during the year. Come to a symposium and present a paper or a poster about your ideas. I guarantee you we are looking at all of this very carefully, because we don't want to miss the good ideas that are out there. So you can help. In fact, you are the help. And maybe that's it. Yeah, now, right as my time ends, the most foolhardy projections. So further into the future, you saw that progression from patients to workers to environment, animals, and so on. Will we go further later into protection of all living things? I don't even know what that means, to be honest, so I'm skeptical. And what about environments without life? Should we worry about a bunch of extra thorium in some rocks or on a beach somewhere? Maybe, because life might want to go there. I don't know, it's just a thought. I think what's more realistic is that human space exploration and just colonization might push technical advances in RP. You can't live in free space for a long time without getting a lot of dose. Radiation exposure is a stop for the Mars missions unless you treat it properly, and it looks like it'll be okay. Living on a planet that doesn't have the magnetic shield that we do is problematic unless you want to live underground, and that's not very exciting. So I think in 20, 30, 40 years from now, there'll be lots more people in space, and we'll be worried a lot more about their protection. Maybe in the far distant future, maybe in the near distant future, some advanced treatment might reduce or eliminate concerns about radiation-induced cancer or all cancers. That would be wonderful, but science has been working on that for ever. So I don't know how quickly that will come, but that would be great. And you'd think, well, if there's no more cancer, there's no more RP. But I think even then, acute effects from very high doses, which shouldn't happen very often, but do, might continue to be a concern. So maybe our job will be way easier, but probably not disappear. And you can forget all of that because it's probably mostly nonsense. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention.